We're jumping back into our journey through Genesis, so grab those Bibles. Turn with me. Genesis chapter 18. If you don't have a Bible, you know the drill. There should be a hardcover black one somewhere near you, or you can just turn on your phone. We're actually going to be jumping around in two chapters today, so spending some time, Genesis chapter 18, verses 6 through 15, and then Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. So Genesis 18 and Genesis 21. So get ready. We're going to jump in there in just 1 second. For those of you maybe just jumping into the series for the first time, welcome to week 15 in Genesis. If you're wondering, Scott, are we ever going to make it out of this book of Genesis? Yes, we will. Eventually, 2027, don't you worry. I'm kidding. Settle down, we'll get through this, okay? But for now, we're working through Genesis. We're really looking at the life of Abraham, and we'll continue in the narrative. So let's just jump right in. Genesis chapter 18. I'll start reading in verse 6. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd, and he took a calf tender and good and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. Verse 12. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh." Now let's jump ahead. Chapter 21, I want to read starting in verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." And she said, Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." So here's the thing, okay? You can't live without laughter, all right? At this point in the text, and we're going to work through this, all right? This is really what we're seeing in this text, okay? God comes into a life to bring laughter. So Sarah says, "God has made laughter for me." God transformed her bitter, cynical laughter, and he turned it into this laughter of joy, and that's what we'll see. But here's the question for us this morning, okay? How is this even possible? Like how does that work? How can God bring about this permanent, deep joy that lasts? This is what we'll see in this text. And we're going to notice 4 things in this narrative this morning, in which God comes to Sarah. Okay, first, we're just going to look at the fact that God does show up. God does come to Sarah. Second, we'll look at how God comes to Sarah. Third, we'll look at why God comes to Sarah. And then finally, we're going to wrap it all up by looking at how God can come to us too. So we'll notice that he shows up. We'll notice how he shows up, why he shows up, and how he can show up to us. That's where we're going this morning. You have my outline hang in there. Here we go. First thing we're going to look at, we're going to notice that God showed up. He came to Sarah. All right, God comes. Remember, up until this point, we know that God has showed up to Abraham. And what has he said? He said, Abraham, I am going to turn you into a great nation. Like this new people, this new civilization, really. This new people group coming out of your descendants. And from your descendants, I'm not only going to bring about a new people, I am going to, and this is what God says, I'm going to bless the whole world. I'm going to bless the nations through you. And therefore, I'm going to give your wife, Sarah, a son. That was a promise, but that promise was a while ago now. It was given 25 years ago, and years have gone by, and they've gotten older and older and older. Sarah's now in her 90s at this point. Abraham is 100. And one day, this is Genesis chapter 18, 3 random strangers just happened to come to the tent of Abraham. 3 wanderers, 3 travelers, and it's, of course, the Lord and 2 angels, though, of course, that's not immediately apparent to them. And the first thing that Abraham does is he shows hospitality to these strangers, and you see that in the first few verses. Abraham and Sarah, they're frantically running around, trying to get everything in order, prepare them a meal. For us, it's like we read this and it's a little strange. Like, what's the rush? Like, just slam the door in their face, send them on their way, right? But for them, hospitality was of highest priority. It was their duty. That's what you did in those days. When a traveler would come by, you would do everything in your power you could to help them rest, help them get refreshed, so that they can continue in their journey. So Abraham, what's he doing? He's showing hospitality to these 3 men, these 3 figures, these 3 strangers just outside the tent. Sarah is inside the tent, just inside the flap of the tent, listening to this conversation unfold. And look at this. I want you to see chapter 18, verse 10. Okay, the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. So God showed up to Sarah. And here's the question, why? Why did he show up? Why did he come? Like, if you think about it, it's really amazing, all right? God is appearing. He is showing up to them visibly. Like, visibly. God's appearing. He's showing up. Why? Well, he's not come for Abraham. I think he has come specifically for Sarah. Like, he's not showing up to speak to Abraham again. He's showing up to have a conversation with Sarah. Why do I think that? Because God has already showed up to Abraham. He's already spoke audibly to Abraham. He's repeated the promise over and over and over again. God's not here for Abraham. He's here for Sarah. This time, it's Sarah, okay? But why? That's the question. Why? It's not like he arrives on the scene to give new information. We don't read any new information here. That's not what we see, okay? Sarah already knows about this God. Sarah already knows all about the promises that this God had communicated to Abraham. So God is not saying anything here that she doesn't already know, because she's heard it all from her husband, Abraham. So why is he even going through the trouble of appearing to her? Here's why. This brings me to my first point, okay? It's because it's not good enough to know God through someone else. That's why. Sarah believes in God, but she doesn't really believe in God. She knows about God, but she's never come to know God. Like, everything she knows about God, or about the promises of God, she knows through Abraham. Because of Abraham, she has not come to know on her own. And just knowing God through someone else, not good enough. You have to have your own encounter, your own dialogue, your own experience, your own relationship with him. You cannot do it through someone else. This reminds me of a verse, Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. Here it is. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice, opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. So some people, if you think about this, some people have great discipline, okay? They read the word, they spend time in prayer, they go to church every time the doors are open, right? They're checking all these external boxes, but they've never had a personal encounter with Jesus. In other words, and I'll use the language of this text on this side, there we go. Jesus is standing just outside the door and knocking, and they've never opened up the door. Right? They're doing their best to sort of have a conversation, but they're talking through this closed door. It's not enough to just know about this God. It's not enough to just read his word. You need to have a personal encounter with Jesus. You need to have a personal relationship with him. You need to open up the door. So there might be someone in your life who you know who sort of had this personal encounter, right? And maybe that person's just always getting on your case, like, you need to read the word more, you need to pray more, you need to go to church more, and maybe that's the reason why you're here. Welcome. We love you, okay? And if someone asks, like, are you a follower of Jesus? What do you say? You're like, well, yeah, I'm a follower of Jesus. Like, I do all this stuff, and I might not be as intense as my friend over there, because they're crazy. But yeah, I think I know Jesus. Listen to me, okay? I love you. This isn't an issue of just getting to know Jesus more. All right? This is, you've got to open the door. You've got to let him in. Sarah gets this visit from God, not to get information that she already knew, but so that she could have this personal encounter with him. Like you have to have one. You have to have one. So that's the first thing we see, okay? God came to Abraham, or God came for her. God came to Sarah, okay? But we also see, and here's the question, how? How'd this happen? Remember a few weeks ago, the last time, I think it was, the last time that we saw God showed up to someone. I think it was Genesis chapter 15, okay, where God shows up to Abraham. Maybe you remember that text, maybe you don't. I'll remind you what happens, okay? It's a different scene. You couldn't imagine just a more vastly different scene than there is here. Okay? Genesis 15, God shows up, and there is darkness. And here, Genesis 18, well, it's the middle of the day, broad daylight, a little different. Genesis 15, God shows up in the smoking fire pot, this flaming torch. But here, God shows up, it's a guy with sore feet. He's accessible, he's familiar. He's so familiar that they don't even realize who they're talking to for a long time. All right, Genesis 15, God shows up to Abraham, and there's this like crushing dread. And here, like, look how gentle God is. Like, look at this. Sarah laughs, all right? And here's what she says, and it is much more bitter, cynical, self-hating than it might seem on the surface, okay? Genesis 18, verse 12. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? That phrase, worn out. That's an interesting phrase. That's a phrase that means useless, good for nothing. It's a very negative word to describe yourself. She's like, I am useless. I'm no good. And we're also old. Physically speaking, Abraham and I, we haven't touched each other in years, let alone anything else. There's no way we're having a son. That's not happening. And how does God react? How does he react? This is so different from the dramatic, fiery voice that Abraham experienced in Genesis chapter 15. I am the Lord. Right? That's not what happens here. It's gentle. She laughs at him. All right, at the Lord of the universe. She laughs in his face, And what does he say? How dare you laugh at me? No. How does God react? Well, he repeats her objection, but he doesn't repeat all the nasty things that she said about herself. He's just like, I'm not going to repeat it. I'm not going to say that stuff. And then he reassures her. He says, I will come back. And then she just continues to lie. She's like, I didn't laugh. I didn't do it. And then you can almost hear this smile on God's face when God's like, oh, Sarah, but you did. You did laugh. I'm telling you, you couldn't imagine two more vastly different experiences, vastly different appearances of God. So what is going on? Why would God be so different for Sarah? And here's why, okay? It's because you can't put God in a box. All right, God comes to different people in different ways. Some people, they meet God. They have this personal encounter with God in these difficult times, in these times of trial. Some people, it just happens when they're sipping coffee on the porch, this beautiful sunrise, and they're just overwhelmed by the love and the grace of God. You can't put God in a box. So don't worry if your experience looks different than somebody else's, because you might not have the same experience. That's okay. You can't look to you can't look to your experience, and you can't say, well, you're not a genuine follower of Jesus because you didn't experience the same thing that I experienced over here. Again, you can't put God in a box. God shows up different to different people. And here's the one thing I want to point out, okay? Did you notice here how she says, I didn't laugh. And God says, oh, but you did laugh. You did. Like, God is so approachable. So don't be afraid to tell God. Don't be afraid to tell God your weaknesses and your failures. Don't be afraid to be real with God. Don't be afraid. He's not going to blow up at you. He didn't to Sarah, so he won't to you. And here's another way you can actually think through this verse, okay? If somebody is lying to you, if somebody is deceiving you, don't blow up at them, right? Why? Here's why. Because if the God of the universe isn't insulted when somebody lies to him, then why in the world do you think you have the right to be insulted when someone lies to you? Don't do it. There you go. Let's continue. So it's clear that the Lord came to Sarah. We see how he came to Sarah. Gentle, approachable. And now we see why. Well, it's clear in this text, and I'll show you. The Lord came to transform her laughter. Okay, look at this, verse 13. The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say all those nasty things about herself? Why, Abraham, is her laughter so bitter and cynical and self-hating? And then God answers his question. He answers his question in the next verse, and we'll read it in just a second. Takes the form of a question, but it's definitely the answer to this question. Look at this, verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Let's stop right there. This is the explanation for why Sarah is the way that she is, okay? He says, is anything too hard for the Lord? The Hebrew word used there is the word for wonder. All right, it's the word you see over and over again in the Psalms when it's talking about the wonders of God, how great and mighty are his works and his deeds. So God is saying, is anything too wonderful for me? Is anything? Essentially, here's what God is saying. Sarah is filled with this bitter, cynical laughter because she is without wonder. Her heart is missing wonder. Of course, wonder is a difficult thing to describe. All right, I think the best way I can describe it is by looking at young kids, okay? I'm not saying all the time, because they definitely have their moments, but most of the time when little kids are just going about living their lives, they're just living life, having a good time. I have rarely caught young children walking around going, life just stinks. I have no meaning in life. This is the worst. No, life is good because their life is filled with wonder. All right, it doesn't take much for a kid to just be in awe. It doesn't take much for something to make a kid's day. I'll use this as an example. I don't remember if it was last week, Easter Sunday, maybe the next day. The weather was nice. We were out for a drive, right? And for some reason, the girls wanted the windows down. So we rolled down the windows, and all of a sudden, their hair's blowing like crazy in the breeze. I hear Lillian, all right, the youngest, in the back. She screams, "This is the best Easter ever!" All because I rolled down her window, right? It doesn't take much. But I am fully aware of how quickly this will fade. Think about it, because as kids get older and older, that wonder just starts to dissipate, right? And maybe you've noticed that, okay? You can take a 4-year-old to a beach, and they're like, wow. You take a 14-year-old to a beach, and they're like, wow, when are we going home, right? Are we done yet? As time progresses, what happens is it takes more and more to fill the heart with wonder. So here's what happens. Like, the stories need to get better and better and better. Things need to get bigger and bigger. It gets more and more difficult to be filled with wonder. And that, honestly, that's a bad thing because you can't live without it. So what do? Okay? I think what we do, we try and find it anywhere we can, okay? Through stories, through movies, for example. We're just drawn to good stories. And for a story to be good, it needs to have, I think, 3 elements, okay? We're drawn to stories that show us that there is something beyond ourselves, some power that needs to be tapped into, something bigger than us. All right, we're drawn to stories, number 2, that bring us into an impossible, hopeless situation. All hope is lost. There's no hope. And finally, here's the most important part. We're drawn to stories that have this heroic key, this one heroic element to get us out of those situations that we're in, bring about that power that's beyond ourselves, to bring about redemption, rescue, restoration, resolution, salvation, the end. Good story right there. 3 elements to every good story. And what do? Okay? We end up spending way too much money on these summer blockbusters with poor acting, terrible special effects, cheesy one-liners, all so we can just have a little bit of wonder just for a minute. But the moment we get home, the wonder is gone. It's fleeting. But the gospel story, that's different. The gospel is the ultimate story, the true story that if you believe, right, you're going to be filled with wonder that lasts. So God comes to Sarah, transforms that laughter. How? By giving her wonder. Look at what it says, chapter 21, verse 6. Okay, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. It's a bit confusing at first because it's like, wait, what? You were just laughing. So now you're laughing again. I don't get it. What's the point? The fact that she can talk about this laughter as something that God has just stirred in her means that this laughter is a different sort of laughter. This isn't the bitter, cynical sort of laughter. This is laughter that's filled with wonder. And where did this laughter come from? Well, look at how this chapter starts. Verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. God was gracious. The grace of God came into her life. The grace of God overwhelmed the impossibility of her situation. Cynical laughter says, I'm in an impossible situation and there's no way out. So you just laugh to make light of the situation, the hopeless situation you find yourself in. There's Nervous, anxious laughter, right? Like, oh, I'm a little nervous here, but I can do this, so you laugh and you try and fend off that anxiety that you're probably not going to be able to fight off, right? This laughter is different. God has overcome the impossible situation with his power, and she is just wondering at it, right? He's filled her with wonder, and now she's just filled with this laughter of grace. She says, I'm now laughing. God made me laugh in a way that I've never laughed before. Her life was just filled with wonder, and because of it, her whole life has changed. So here's the question. Here's the question for us as we kind of wrap this all up. How can that happen to us? How can we find that sort of joy? How can God come to us like he came to Sarah? A lot of times, here's what happens. We read passages like this, and we're like, oh, that's great. I see exactly what we need to do to live the life that Sarah lived. Sarah was 90 years old, and she got what she wanted, right? So we got to be like Sarah. Got to be like Sarah. We just have to believe. We have to pray. We have to trust in God. Shoot for the stars. And nothing is impossible with God. God will provide. So we need shoot for the stars. Impossible goals. Trust in him. Can you tell I don't like that? I don't, right? I'll tell you why, okay? I don't like it because it's wrong. Done. No, I'm kidding. When we do that, we are making two very big mistakes with this text. We're making a logical mistake, and we are making what's called an exegetical or an interpretive mistake, okay? First, just think about this logically, real quick. The greatest man who ever lived. I don't think this is going out on a limb. He had a better prayer life than you ever will, right? He had more faith than you ever will. And how did it turn out for him? He was abandoned by his friends. He was forsaken by the Father. And somehow you think that you're going to be able to do better than he did? I doubt it. I doubt it. But we're also making an interpretive or an exegetical mistake when you apply the text like that because, well, does this text teach us that if you just believe like Sarah, then God will do incredible things? No, it doesn't. Why? What's the problem? The problem is Sarah didn't believe. That's the whole point of the text. She laughs at God. Right? She's not down on her knees crying out to the Lord, trusting in him, full of faith. Lord, I know you can do anything. I'll give it to you. She's laughing in his face. Right? So if you want to interpret the text like that, then this is what you have to say. Okay? Sarah had this incredible goal, and if we're going to be like Sarah and get what we want, so desperately want, then we're going to have to do what Sarah did. We should laugh at God. No, don't do that. Okay? That's ridiculous. The thing that unlocked the door, okay, the thing that brought the power of God into her life wasn't faith because she didn't have any. It was grace. The Son of promise came into her life and into the world because of grace. The gospel, it's the ultimate story. Every other story gives you a little bit of wonder just for a little bit, but God says, listen, I've got a story that if you believe and if you take into your heart, it is going to fill you with the wonder that lasts. But what's that story? Is that story literally Abraham and Sarah and Isaac? No, that's not the story. It's the story that this story points to. So in Luke chapter 1, an angel shows up to another woman. This is centuries later, all right? And the angel says to the woman, you're going to have a son. And very much like Sarah, the woman responds, how can this be? Almost laughing, very skeptical, like Sarah was. And do you know why? Because if it was impossible for Sarah to have a son with an old husband, then how much more impossible would it have been for Mary to have a son with no husband? Right, so when Mary says to the angel, how can this be? The angel responds, nothing is impossible with God. Do you see the parallels between that passage and this? Man, Luke wants us to see this. Luke wants us to see the similarities because he's showing us something. Jesus is the true Isaac. Jesus is the ultimate son of promise. He's the one in whom we hear the laughter of God's grace, victory over our impossible situation. And our situation was far more impossible. We were far worse off than Sarah was. The true Isaac, Jesus Christ, came into the world to deal with our problem, Satan, sin, and death. He gave us life eternal, and he's adopted us, brought us into the family of God because of Jesus. He took the death so that we can live. I'm telling you, every other story wears off. You watch a good movie and you're pumped for about 2.5 seconds. But this story will never fade. If it comes into your life, if you see Jesus, not just as some special person who wants to bless your life if you follow him, but as the true Isaac, then your life will have wonder and your laughter will be transformed. Not based on your performance, but because of grace. So I promise I'm going to wrap this all up, okay? Here's the question. How can this happen to us? How can we be sure that we've moved from knowing about God to actually knowing God? How can I be certain that I'm not just religious anymore, but I'm this genuine follower of Jesus? How can you be confident that you're seeing Jesus in this light, the true Isaac? I think, and we can see this from this text quickly, there are 4 signs, 4 marks of a genuine believer in the life of Sarah. First, it's clear that if you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to have the ability to laugh at yourself. And that's clear in Sarah's new image. She's just so humble, but yet so certain. Sarah's like, God has made laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh at me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. She says, who would have thought? It's almost a joke. And many of us, we're of the same mindset. We're like, who would have thought that Jesus could come into my life and just transform me, use me? Who would have thought? Who would have said? But there's also the certainty. Who would have thought? Yet he did. He did. Second, it's clear if you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to have the ability to laugh at what other people think. God has brought, this is what Sarah says, God has brought me laughter, and everyone will laugh over me. In the Hebrew, that's more like everybody will laugh at me. They're going to point at me and laugh, and for good reason. Can you imagine a 90-year-old woman nursing a child? That'd be a sight to see. And yet Sarah doesn't care, right? You don't need other people's approval anymore like you used to. Third, it's clear that if you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to have the ability to laugh at your past because, Sarah, it's clear she's reconciled to her past. Think about this, okay? What was Sarah's greatest failure in life? Very few people have the opportunity to see God face to face. Sarah did only once, and what did she do? She laughed at him. So, probably her greatest failure in life, right? And yet, her son's name is Isaac. Laughter, which shows us just why the gospel is such good news. Because if you believe that you've been saved by works, right? Then those memories of your past, they're just going to be the source of never-ending pain. But the gospel says you've been accepted despite your failures. And those memories of your past, they're not there to crush you. They're there to point you to how great and how wonderful our God is. We're going to be reconciled to our past. Finally, it's clear if you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to be able to laugh at the world's standards. God chose to bring Jesus into the world through this old, worn-out woman. He didn't use fertile, young Hagar. He chose Sarah because that's how our God works. Our God is a God of grace, working to accomplish the impossible, to transform our laughter. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for these couple of chapters. I thank you for Sarah and her life. And it's clear in the narrative that you've come into our lives and you come to transform us. You come to transform our laughter. So we just ask that you'd open up our eyes to the beauty of your word, the beauty of the gospel, the good news, and the beauty of your son, this true Isaac, in whom we have life and adoption as sons and daughters. We love you. We praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.